Welcome back, everybody. If you're learning a language, you can't afford to ignore this video. I've made other videos about how to learn grammatical structures and about how to learn words. There's an entire science of memorization that we don't often talk about as part of our language instruction. But you can memorize the dictionary, learn all the grammar, and it means nothing if you don't master what we're talking about today. You'll be able to understand the surface meaning of a text or spoken utterance, but you won't be able to truly communicate. Today, I'm going to take three key ideas from pragmatics and from anthropology and from the study of cross cultural communication, and I'm going to improve your life, not just in your target language, but for many of you, in your first language. I've taught these key concepts to admirals and generals. I've taught them to negotiators. I've probably taught them to spies, but spies never tell you they're spies. They're tricky like that, and denying being a spy is probably the first thing that they tell you at spy school. I wouldn't know. I'm not a spy. But these concepts are also incredibly useful in the workplace, and honestly, most of the people who learn them get the most mileage out of them in their private lives. So today we're talking about cultural dimensions of communication. I'm going to illustrate the concept with my favorite three: direct versus indirect communication, high versus low context communication, and positive versus negative face. Each of these could probably have its own video and will likely get its own video on the sister channel that I'm launching with some colleagues, the Culture Point Effect. Yes, it's actually coming. Yes, it's very slow. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and on the channel, I discuss everything related to language, linguistics, language learning, and culture. If you're into those topics, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. Today, I'm going to improve your relationships or your money back. This is Language Jones. I want to thank Lingod for sponsoring today's video. Lingod is an online language school, not an app. They offer 5 languages: English, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. I absolutely love Lingod after dabbling in Spanish and doing a sprint in French. The sprint is Lingod's most popular challenge, and for good reason. It motivates learners to commit to 60-minute online lessons, basically daily, and rewards you when you follow through. And that's actually their current promotion. A sprint is 30 lessons in 60 days with 50% cash back or 30 credits upon successful completion. And a super sprint is 60 lessons in 60 days with 50% cash back or 60 more credits on completion. Here's the thing: classes run 24/7 and are a small group with a maximum of 5 students. But more importantly, they're led by real teachers who are certified and are native level, not AI or recordings. I have loved the classes that I've taken with Lingota, and now I'm just deciding what language to do another sprint in. My life's kind of up in the air lately, but I've been dying to get back to Florence. They have the Uffizi Gallery and all of the medieval and Renaissance history, not to mention a beautiful synagogue built after the Jews were emancipated in the 1800s. But if I'm being honest, I've been dying to go back for the world-class espresso. Cosa posso dire? Sono un uomo semplice. Regardless, if you want to level up your language with personalized attention from actual human teachers, you can't do better than Lingota. Click my link in the description to get started and to get 20 euros off. Now back to the video. There's one tiny piece you have to understand before we can get into these concepts. That is that instead of thinking of culture as food and clothing and religion and music and all that colorful stuff that might come to mind when you think of the word culture, one way that anthropologists and organizational behaviorists and others look at culture is with this idea of dimensions. That is, placing things along a spectrum. You're already probably familiar with this way of thinking. If you've ever done a Myers-Briggs assessment, not that I'm endorsing that, you've probably been told whether you're more introverted or extroverted. Polar opposites, but people can fall anywhere in between. You can be slightly extroverted. You can be extremely introverted. If you're watching my channel, you're probably in the middle. I don't know. But the point is that you could probably pick a number from 1 to 100, where 100 is maximally extroverted, and you might be different than the others around you. We can do the same with cultural communication styles, and you'll have your own individual preferences based on your wiring and what's most comfortable for you in your default natural state, that is nature, and what's expected of you in society and culture you grew up in, live in, work in, and are surrounded by, nurture. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the biggest drivers of conflict and the biggest drivers of misunderstanding and the most important concepts for truly understanding not just the words in a language, but what the words are being used to say. I think the biggest 3 factors anybody should consider in any language are direct and indirect communication, high and low context communication, and positive and negative face. First, there's the difference between direct and indirect communication. I have taught thousands of classes on this to hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, I have no idea, and two things always happen. First, when I ask for a definition of indirect communication, people always, and I mean always, blurt out body language. That's a valid secondary modality, to use fancy jargon, but it's not indirect communication, not necessarily. And second, everybody swears they are a direct communicator, but it's not true. So, what is direct communication? It's when the words you say line up with the simplest, plainest, directest, most literal meaning of what's being communicated. Indirect communication is then not that. In linguistics, there's this concept of speech acts. So there's only so many types of things that we do with words. For instance, I can inform you about the world, I can ask a question, I can make a promise or a pledge, I can make a request. In the strictest sense, in the subfield of linguistics called pragmatics, indirect communication is when I mix and match the form and meaning. Let me give you some examples. If I ask you, what time is it? What does that mean? If I'm a direct communicator and I'm communicating directly, we can learn to adapt to different styles after all. It's a request that you tell me what time it is. But if I'm communicating indirectly, it's not a question. Let's work backwards with a scenario. You're my spouse. That's only true for one of you watching this, and you know who you are, but let's imagine. So let's also say that you're chronically late and it's a source of contention and conflict in our relationship. Not true in the real world, but anything is possible in the world of imagination. Furthermore, let's posit you have a doctor's appointment at noon, and it will take you 40 minutes to get there, and it's 11:15 when I ask. I might even know that it's 11:15. So, what's the communicative function then? It's a statement. It's a reminder. It's potentially a way of saving face, which I'll get to very shortly. But that's an important idea. People aren't just beating around the bush when they communicate indirectly. There's often reasons for it, whether it's politeness, avoiding a fight, reluctance to say something outright and on record, or any number of other reasons. Diplomacy is one. And of course, there are just people for whom that's more comfortable than, hey, isn't it time to go? Which is its own form of indirectness, asking when you're really telling. Or even, you need to get ready to leave now. I sometimes talk about neurodivergence and neurospiciness on the channel. For the autistic folks watching, this is something I'm sure you're aware of and annoyed at. I'm convinced most of the study of pragmatics was from people just trying to figure out those unspoken rules that others seem to use without thinking about it. You helpfully say, you need to leave now, and suddenly people are mad, even though they do. This stuff gets associated with gender in different ways across languages and cultures too. So, one example I use of indirect communication is the hypothetical where I'm on a road trip with my wife, and she says, honey, are you hungry? I ask, what does that mean when I'm teaching? And very often I get a chorus of responses, she's hungry, which is only partial credit, because in fact, it's a way of discussing pulling over. It could be time to stretch or use the bathroom or even take over driving because I'm going too slow. But if I just respond to, honey, are you hungry with no and keep driving, have I understood and correctly reacted to that speech act? No. Hilariously, at least to me, I got a great example of indirect communication while writing this script. I emerged from a writing frenzy in my office to go make more coffee, and I started to tell my wife about how I'm finally doing indirect communication on Language Jones, and we'll make a different video about it with a different tone and different examples for the culture point effect. And she said to me, and I quote, do you hear me typing? Pop quiz for the viewers. Was this an inquiry into my auditory perception, or was it, perhaps, just maybe, a way of saying shut the fuck up? Point being, one can be indirect without necessarily being subtle. That's basically the entirety of American Southern nice. For those of you who don't know, they're not blessing your heart, they're calling you a moron with a conventionally indirect cliche. As a quick aside, we tend to pejoratize whatever is the one we don't do. That is, we make it bad. We do this as individuals, and we do this as groups and communities. Neither style, even in the most extreme, is wrong. It's just on us to adapt to those around us. The second dimension is high and low context communication, first identified by, I think, Edward Hall in 1972, if I remember correctly. He kind of links it to a ton of other cultural things, which frankly I don't care about right now. The idea is that high context communication assumes a high degree of shared context. Not everything has to be spelled out. This is different from indirect because it's not like you use a question for a statement or a promise as a question or however you want to remix speech acts, but rather you include or omit information. Low context communicators include all the information. High context communicators might assume you know things that you don't. And languages can push you in a particular direction. Japanese can have a totally valid sentence that's a single verb with no subject or object or tense, and you have to, as they say, read the air. Mathematicians, engineers, and academics of all stripes tend to be low context and direct communicators. But again, not always. I had a Zulu professor who lots of people underestimated because she was high context and indirect. But she was thinking and talking circles around them if only you paid attention and had enough shared context, though. Now, that's two dimensions, which means four combinations. What does direct but high context look like? Well, a colleague of mine basically lives there. One example was visiting Philadelphia with the family. He knew they'd need a bathroom at some point. They'd been before and had used a bathroom in a specific mall that they were near. So he says, that's the mall we were at last time. Extremely direct, but also extremely high context. The background assumptions are that you remember we used the bathroom there and that you recognize you may need a bathroom later today. Indirect and high context, that's something like, remember that mall? Full disclosure, this is not my natural style, so leave me a comment with your best indirect high context way of saying, there's a bathroom in this mall that we used before, and if we need to use the bathroom today, it's there. That's the low context direct one, by the way. Let's multiply those 4 by 2 again, giving us 8 types. Here I'm talking about face. Face is a term we got ultimately from Chinese, mianzi, after the Opium Wars and shit. It was later popularized by the sociologist Irving Goffman and by the linguists Brown and Levinson in their classic, Politeness. The academic literature talks about positive and negative face, but I think those terms are confusing garbage, so I talk about active and passive face. But what is face? Well, it's your desired self-image. Not residual self-image, that's Neo in the loading screen, but it's how you want to be perceived and treated. We always manage what academics call self-face and other face, and we can do all sorts of fun communication around what they call face-threatening acts. FTAs for short. Positive or active face is going out of your way to avoid or mitigate face-threatening acts and to actively say or do things to cultivate self and other face. When I teach in California, which is every now and then, I'll go to the grocery store and the clerk ringing me up will look at the groceries, look at the ingredients, and ask me what I'm making for dinner. That's positive face. Coming from New York, which has the general vibe of don't start none, won't be none. Don't fuck with me and I won't have to fuck with you. That's already a violation. I'm making a family recipe called Nunya. Scandinavians are notoriously negative face oriented to an extreme. If you start up a conversation about the weather, it is excruciating for them. Who is this lunatic who's describing the air outside to me? The American South is very positive face oriented, and in a place like New York, it can change by the block. Lots of places in Harlem are very positive face oriented. You can say hello to people on the street. In fact, you're expected to. Midtown, though? I don't know you. Why are you talking to me? I mentioned that these can create conflict, so let me give you 2 examples. One is in the workplace. I know somebody who referred to herself delightfully, to me at least, as a good morning person. She didn't mean she likes the mornings. She meant she says good morning, and she expects that others say it back. That's positive face, active face. If you just walk up and get down to brass tacks about the report from last Friday or whatever, that's a face-threatening act. She thinks you're uncultured and rude. In the real-life version of this, the good morning person was also high context and indirect, so she started to respond to it by saying, good morning, with a pointed tone of voice, and ultimately expressed her anger and annoyance by not saying good morning at all. The indirectest of messages. The target for this indirect message, indirect non-message, was a direct, low-context, negative-face colleague who actually told me, this is the best working relationship I've ever had. First, good morning, stood on formality, but now we have such a good relationship, we can get right to work. We can dispense with the pleasantries. Yeah, it was bad. Another example that's even spicier is that catcalling video that went around about a decade ago where a woman filmed herself walking through all parts of Manhattan and then characterized everything in the video as catcalling. Some of it was literally positive face cultural expectations in Harlem and other neighborhoods. And some of it was legit harassment. But if you go into it with a negative face expectation, a random man on the street merely saying hello can feel like a verbal assault. Meanwhile, he's from a place where not saying hello is considered rude. Add racial dynamics in history, for instance, a black man with a family history in the South where people were expected to not only address white women politely, but move off the sidewalk for them, and you've got conflict. As a final short aside, one of my favorite parts of Black American culture is the high context, indirect, positive face combination of giving a compliment to a person by describing seeing something. I'm talking about you walk by in your brand new sneakers and somebody calls out, I see you out here with your red shoes, or whatever it is. Talking about, okay braids. This stuff is everywhere, by the way. Some of you already see how this relates to language learning, but let me give some concrete examples. First, let's take everybody's favorite YouTube genre, shocking locals with fluent, whatever the fuck. I've already said this multiple times on my channel. When you go put strangers on camera and speak Chinese at them, when they say, wow, your Chinese is so good. Wow, 你说中文说得真厉害. It doesn't actually mean your Chinese is so good. Now, though, we have the tools to discuss what's going on here. First, you've created a face-threatening act, not just for the other person, but for yourself. I briefly mentioned this in my video on pronouns, but there's also a cultural dimension of individualism versus community focus. With a more communal focus, there's actually a strong drive to help prevent you from publicly humiliating yourself. It's a failure on their part. So you've created a stressful situation. There's a positive face orientation, and many speakers of Chinese languages come from cultures that value indirectness and high context. So they've got to say something, and they can't say, Mandarin is my fourth language, and I don't understand what you just tried to say to me. So they pivot to a compliment. Wow, you're speaking Chinese, when they have no idea what you're saying and don't want to humiliate you. There's a reason you don't see this genre as much with Russian or Dutch. The Dutch will absolutely be charmed that you're speaking Dutch, but then they'll dress you down in English for a few minutes because they're direct, low context, and negative face. Why are you learning Dutch though? We all speak English. It's useless to you. You should stop. Also, you've made the following 12 mistakes I can correct. The French, on the other hand, especially in Paris, are liable to just tell you in French that they don't understand you and to stop wasting their time. They're culturally indirect, except when it comes to negative feedback, the exact opposite of Americans in general, who are culturally direct, except when it comes to negative feedback. You're doing a great job. Keep up the good work. There's just one little thing we could fix. Oh, here's another one. In Persian culture, you're expected to offer food if hosting. The guest is expected to refuse politely at least twice, if not 3 times. It's what Brown and Levinson call a conventionalized politeness routine. Americans without this cultural knowledge, being hosted by Persians, will just say yes and take a cookie and tea? Rude. Persians hosted by Americans will say no twice and then not be given the hospitality that one should expect. Rude. Notice what happens. You can know all the words, but if you don't understand the script, you're going to have conflict. And this stuff affects long-term relationships. This is why a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Lots of apps and textbooks and even some classroom study can give the mistaken impression that if you just know enough words, you can translate your thoughts. But the key to learning a language is to have different thoughts. I don't mean this in a stupid Sapir Whorf way. I mean that we have to learn cultural styles and be able to express them appropriately. So what happens though when you're low context, direct, and say negative face, and you're learning a language where the overall culture, remember, individuals have their own preferences too, is the opposite? Well, it means you have to learn how to do things with words. And for those of us on the direct end of the spectrum, let me give you some things that don't work. Avoid these. 1, telling people they're indirect and you're direct. Every extremely direct communicator I've ever taught this to felt like they finally understood relationships, only to run off and immediately tell an indirect communicator that they now understand they're direct and their interlocutor is indirect. Take a second. If you were looking for an indirect message in that, what might you recover? The most common is, you talk wrong and I'm going to fix you. Not good. 2, learning how indirect and high context communication works, using it, and then being unable to resist asking directly if you succeeded at indirect communication. This one is super hard for people. It's like, I'm doing it. Wait, am I doing it? When you add another language and culture into the mix, it can be really confusing. You can only succeed if you're dealing with somebody with a high degree of cultural intelligence, infuriatingly called CQ and not CI, but that's a different video for a different day. If you made it this far and you want to know more about that, leave me a comment with either CQ or CI in your comment. Oh, and it cuts both ways. Indirect and high context communicators insist that they are direct in low context. It's just not so direct in low context that it would be rude. So they think they're hitting you over the head with something, when in reality, they've gone from 100% indirect to like 99% indirect. They'll go from, we have chairs, to anybody can sit in the chairs we have, and think that they're being direct when those of us on the other end of the spectrum are waiting for some version of, please sit down in this chair. Notice how that was indirect. Notice how the first one was indirect. It was a statement instead of a command or a suggestion, and it was high context. What do people do with chairs? Maybe put 2 and 2 together, and you'll do what people do with chairs. So how do you get good at this stuff? Well, the first step is awareness, even just knowing these differences exist. The second is paying attention to them and when they might be in play, mindfulness. The third is really trying to learn how they work. When I watch TV and say French, yes, I'll watch for the plot, but I'll also be paying attention to how interactions happen in various environments, shops, cafes, workplaces, and how much more so when I actually travel. This is such a dorky anthropologist kind of thing, but I definitely remember loitering across the street from a cafe in France when I was much younger just to watch how the interactions happen. You don't walk in, look for a host, and wait to be seated. I made that mistake the first time. That's why I was across the street from a different cafe. You walk up to a table outside, sit down, and wait for them to come to you. It's worth doing that with a language. Ask yourself, what is this person doing with the words, and how are they doing it with those words? And then it's practice. Hopefully you enjoyed this and can get some use out of it. I always hear that it's great for work and travel and such, but it really helps people with their personal relationships. I've had nuclear engineers realize in my class that their direct, low context, negative face and a handful of other cultural preferences like bottom line up front and one thing at a time, and that their spouses are literally the opposite on every cultural parameter. Even if I didn't just explain your marriage, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, leave me a comment with where you've seen this at play, your wildest story about it, or where you're just now realizing it was at play. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can always support it on YouTube with super thanks, or over on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. Leave me a comment, they are great for the algorithm, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, happy learning.